My name is Jeff Staple. I am the founder and creative director of Staple Design. For me, I grew up from ages 0 through 17 in like suburban New Jersey, like in the middle of New Jersey, where there were very few minorities and people of color. So to give you an example, my high school graduation class was 1,600 kids. 3 Asians were in that entire 1,600 graduating class. And so I didn't see people who looked like me, and my childlike reaction to that was to try to assimilate with the majority, to blend in and not bring attention to myself. And inherently what happens when I do that is I start to diminish and minimize who I really am, and to the extreme, feel embarrassed about who I am, which I did big time. Like, I didn't want people to come to my house because it smelled like Chinese food, and my mom would pack me a lunch and it'd be like weird dumplings and chicken wings, and I would like throw it away before I got to the lunchroom to just get a PB&J so that I looked normal. Meanwhile, now everyone would have loved that I bring dumplings into the room, but like back then it was a different story. When I finished high school, I went to New York University for 2 years with a journalism degree. And then I went to Parsons School of Design after that. And the biggest shock to me was that like I wasn't the minority anymore. I mean, I still was a minority, but like now at NYU, it's like 40% Asian, and it's like, wow, I see so many people that are like, that look like me and that can relate. So that was brewing in my head. But that's it, that's all that was happening. Sort of this like self-realization, sometimes mixed with angst at like who I was trying to perpetrate being. But then also still like self-hating my own race sometimes. Like there's like that self-racism that happens. So a lot of like mental sort of distractions that were going on in my head. Back in 1996, I was a student at Parsons, trying to figure out how I wanted to express myself, right? Like, what the hell do I want to say? And then 2, how do I say it, right? Do I first figure out the message, then figure out the medium, okay? And I started to form what my message was. And for me, streetwear was introduced because I was actually interning while I was going to school at Parsons at a company called PNB Nation. And PNB Nation was one of the first ever streetwear brands in New York City. And I would argue that streetwear was born in New York City. So you could argue that PNB was like one of the first streetwear brands in the world also. And, having an internship there was great because prior to that, I didn't know a thing called streetwear existed. And in fact, there probably wasn't even a term thrown around yet. There was, as I mentioned before, there was like skate wear, action sports as it was called. There was urban wear, which was directly inspired by hip hop. And then of course there was like contemporary fashion, which is like the Gap and J. Crew of the world. And there was sort of people doing something that rode the line on all of those things, like sort of in between those things and sampling all of those things. And that would eventually be called streetwear. And so that's where I really got my chops learning from those guys. Now, some of those early architects of streetwear were PNB Nation, 555 Soul. Those were the 2 sort of real like New York flag bearers, if you will. There's 4 founders of PNB Nation, but the lead guy's name is Brew McHale. He is half Jamaican, half Chinese. And he really took me under his wing as a mentor. And it was amazing to hear how he was thinking and how he said, Jeff, anything you create, it has to provoke some sort of thought. It doesn't matter if people love it or hate it. That's where you've won, if you've caused a reaction. If you've created something and 100 people don't react to it at all, that's when you know you failed as a creative. So just provoke thought. That's it. And that just blew me away. And so then I was able to take those feelings that I had and start processing them into the medium, which was graphics on t-shirts. And I started to think that like, if I can start portraying some of these messages onto garments that people would want to rock versus like a dissertation in a book or like, something like that is very heady and academic and people can absorb. But if I made it fly and on a t-shirt, people might be able to spread what I was thinking and spread my ideas. So yeah, that was the original impetus for Staple. And you have to remember back then in the mid 90s, I mentioned some of these brands before, but like Fat Farm, Echo, FUBU, Sean John, Rockaware, these were like the brands where if you wanted to represent to people that you were quote unquote down, you would rock these brands. But these brands were like sort of graphically ugly to me, except Echo, of course. It didn't represent, you know what I mean? Like I mentally concurred with what they were saying, but I didn't want to wear a big FB on my chest, you know? So I was like, I want to do something a little bit more like timeless and essential, like something that you kind of can't live without. And so that's when it was like, yo, staple, that's where staple came from, something that you cannot live without, you know? It was my reactionary answer to spinning rims and popping bottles and bling bling. It was like, no, let's go back to the basic element, right? And actually hip hop had a huge play in that too, because of the whole sort of like bad boy era of hip hop. I was much more in tune with like the more conscious side of hip hop. I was actually also working part-time at Rawkus Records, which was the home of like Talib Kweli, Mos Def, Common, you know, DJ Spinna, like a lot of other great artists. So I was much more in line with that world of consciousness. And so like I was trying to portray that in my fashion as well. You know, you could argue that like on the periphery outside of PNB Nation and 555, you had Echo, Mark Echo's line. You had, Zoo York. So you had Echo, you had Zoo York, and you had Fat Farm. So those three were like, but those three were much more like both feet in their world. So like Echo and Fat Farm were like both feet firmly in urban, but other kids were adapting them. Zoo York was firmly 2 feet in skateboarding, other kids were adapting them. 555 and PNB were the two bigger brands that were like, we're not that category, we're a different thing, you know, and kids were starting to adapt to them. There were also some smaller brands and artists and designers back in that day, such as Stash and Futura, Eric Hayes, another brand called Pervert. These are all sort of like the smaller ones. 555 and PNB were really the ones that got like international distribution and global awareness. And then of course on the West Coast, you had a brand called Stussy that was doing their thing, which was, you know, arguably Stussy is one of the also architects of streetwear. You had an artist named Shepard Fairey as well that was doing his bombing and stickering with his Obey campaign, which would eventually become Obey, the streetwear brand. So these things were all just bubbling at the time. And that was all happening in America. Now, you know, because I've been in the game for so long, I've begun to unearth some of the things that were happening in Europe and Asia as well. And so now I know that what was happening in London was a store called Gimme 5, which was run by a gentleman named Michael Koppelman, and also Fraser Cook was involved in that. And you know, Fraser Cook is now sort of one of the pinnacle keystones of Nike and all the exciting things that they do from an energy standpoint. So it's cool to see him going from like one single shop in London all the way to like global Nike energy. And then in Japan, you had an individual by the name of Hiroshi Fujiwara, who was the first person who really brought hip hop and skate culture in its pure form to Japan. He was a DJ of both music, but also a DJ of like fashion and just a remixer and a stylist. So he was one of the first people to come over there. Working under Hiroshi Fujiwara was two individuals named Nigo and Jun Takahashi, who would eventually do Undercover and Bathing Ape. So you had like, if you look at all the things that I just described, you had these tiny little like molecular pockets of buzz happening in New York, LA, London, and Tokyo. All of us, I guarantee you, did not know what the hell we were doing in any capacity except being able to express ourselves and hopefully pay rent. And the fan base was also minuscule. You know, you're talking like maybe 100 people in New York City that were into this. You're talking about less than 20 stores in the entire world that would support this. And so the cool thing about it back then was that if you were wearing a PNB or a 555 shirt, you know, walking down Broadway and you saw another guy wearing PNB, you could literally, like, that's your friend now. Like, you could be like, yo, where'd you get, oh my God, you know this, you know the story? Like, and it was just a community that was building, and we would all go hang out at Union in West Broadway or 555, you know, and it was that sort of bonding that would occur. And we were all into the very similar things. We were into like hip hop, skate, sneaker culture, sports, design, art, like all of these things that like everyone else didn't understand why one single person should be into all of those things. And the other really cool thing that I've noticed now that didn't mean anything back then was the fact that racial lines were like blurred. Like it wasn't like, oh, that's for black kids, that's for white kids, that's for Asian kids. Like in Union and 555, it was like all mixed. But it was so cool that like we didn't even notice it. It wasn't like when you're at dinner, it's like, oh, there's a mixed culture of people here. Like, no, it was just people of similar interests, you know, so that's what was really dope about it. I think I wanted to work in the streetwear industry because I couldn't categorize myself in any other bucket that existed before that. So while I was into skating, I wasn't a full-on skater. While I was into rock, I wasn't a rock head. While I was into hip-hop, I wasn't a full-on hip-hop head. I was also a design head, you know, I was also a sneaker head and a sports head, and like streetwear or street culture was really the only thing that was able to sample all of those elements. And I felt like, you know, it wasn't even a choice that I made. It was almost like by default the only thing I could get into.